motherhood, or they're coerced into low-paying majors, because you will make more money if you major in petroleum engineering rather than social work or early childhood education. But I'm thinking young women today are some of the most informed and, as I said, self-determined people there could be. And I think when women have children, if you have to work it out with your spouse if you can, if you want to work full-time and someone has to take care of the child, or you have enough money to pay for someone. But it's not clear to me how we would resolve this in some kind of social policy way. I mean, you can have more daycare at work and so forth. That would certainly help, but it's not going to close the gap.
I think it's an interesting statistics. I think that you mentioned that over 80 to 90% of students in the 5 worst paying college degrees are women. And you mentioned our early childhood education, psychology, social work, human services, community organizing. And then I think 70% of students in the best paying college degrees are men. Yes. So I think those are statistics that are actually real and
not only
important,
that,
and we feel
like I was debating a feminist, she said even in the same profession, like nursing, it was a traditionally male field, and male nurses, there are not that many of them, but those that are there earn more. And I looked at some research on nursing and pay and so forth, and it turns out that male nurses gravitate to the highest paying subspecialty, which is nurse anesthesiology. And they're more willing to move to cities that have higher pay. Now, again, there is a gender issue there, but it may be a human issue and not something we can blame.
Right, not a systemic issue, more a choice issue, but also something, I think, as parents, that we need to kind of let our daughters make them aware of the consequences of some of the choices. Yes. So let's talk a little bit, and you touched on this, kind of this disconnect between this reality of the advancement of women, the presence of women in college, and then what we hear in academia, in education, in the media, and kind of this victim and still somewhat like oppressed situation of women, and that we are so far behind in so many things. And what do you think is the impact on the psyche of our society?
I think that's probably what motivated me to start writing on this topic. I was a philosophy professor, and I was the chair of my department asked me to teach a course on gender theory, feminist theory, and I thought, well, okay, I'm a theorist and a feminist, and okay, I'll try. And I sent away for the texts, and I was kind of horrified by these textbooks in many ways, partly because they didn't really represent both sides of some controversial issues. It was almost as if, as a professor, I was there to be an activist rather than a college professor. And I always thought, as a philosophy professor, thou shalt teach both sides of the argument. And these texts didn't do that. The other thing that surprised me, they were just relentlessly negative about and I felt bad, the young women in my classes reading all of this information, telling them that they were an oppressed class, that there was this dynamic, systemic sexism, and that men had privilege and they had burdens and so forth. And there were just so many half-truths and untruths. And so when I wrote this book, Who Stole Feminism, part of what I did in that book was to try to correct the myths and get good information. And there's actually an anthropologist, Alice Degler, whom I like very much, and she once said that if you want a better society, if you want justice, she tells this to her leftist friends, she's more on the left, she said you have to care about truth. She said evidence is an ethical issue. Her phrase is carpe datum. So
carpe datum, I love that.
But I believe in that. I honestly believe in that, and because I don't think you can address problems if you don't tell the truth about them. And because how else are you going to measure progress? If you exaggerate a problem, and I think the feminist groups, the women's groups routinely exaggerate how bad things are for women, and the media follows suit, and then you have scarce resources to solve social problems. You might be addressing a problem that doesn't exist, or is doesn't need your help. I see so much of that we're just pouring resources into closing gaps that may reflect nothing more than the preferences of a majority of women. So that's how I got into this, to try to correct myths, and I started a series on YouTube called The Factual Feminist.
Oh, yeah.
And every week for several weeks, for a couple of years, I corrected myths. And at one point, my late mother asked me, she said, aren't you going to run out of information? You're doing this every week. I said, Mom, this could go on forever. And just that week, Reuters put out, they have a research institute at Reuters, and they put out a study that of the 10 most dangerous countries on the planet for women, and the United States was on the list. You know, North Korea wasn't there, Iran wasn't there.
Yeah, right.
And so, again, and this was carried, newspapers, just the headline, the worst country for women, the U.S. is on the list. Massive amount of misinformation, bad news, and it's twisted.
Well, I think you touched, let's pick up on that, actually, on the women around the world. I think, like, women are not united in defending women's right? And the same people who will believe that all women should be trusted and believed as part of the Me Too movement are now walking the streets in support of Hamas and their advocate and all of the atrocities that they did towards women and children, and somehow those get disqualified. Like, there's a disconnect there about the state of women in this country and what is happening to women around the world, and we're not united on the same front. And what do you think, like, what should be the direction of,
well, I've noticed this,
that key tenets of, like, we should turn our support to women outside of the U.S. so they achieve the same level as that we have here?
Well, and this is the thing. There are women's groups in every country in the world. They're women struggling for their rights, and many of them, in Cambodia or most parts of Africa and the Middle East, they haven't had, let alone a first and second wave, they haven't had so much as a ripple. And they ask for our help. And I've been to international women's conferences and meet fantastic women who, the Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Sojourner Truth of their country, and very inspiring. But they often ask, where are the feminists? They're kind of alone when it comes to the organized American women's movement, because the American women's movement was so focused on convincing American women that they are oppressed, that they just don't have room, to open to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world sort of discredits the assumption that things are so terrible here because, as I said, American women are among the most liberated. And so people ask me, well, why are you still a feminist if you think most of the work is done? Well, for one reason, it's not done globally. There's still a lot of places in the world where women are held back, and there are just all sorts of obstacles to their capacity and freedom to flourish. So I would like a movement that would, establish contact, but as you say, we don't see it. Even, the young women in Afghanistan who are now not in school at all.
Yeah, somehow that's just not being talked about.
Well, you just go and look at the website. There must be some women's group. I keep looking and hoping to find one that might evolve to care about the status of women across the world, but it's mostly captive to kind of radical ideology that I found in those textbooks many years ago. It's just never changed. It gets more and more radical, more and more intolerant, more and more one-sided, and the fact is, it doesn't represent the majority of women. So what
should be, then, is the tenets of feminism today? I think, sadly, I feel like women as a category is disappearing.
Yeah, that's a new problem.
That's like, and I think, like, there is too. I feel like our new line of defense is to recognize the biological differences because it impacts the healthcare access, the research that is being done on how our metabolism processes medical treatments.
And
men have 40%.
We had Title IX and women got in sports, and now they've changed the definition of
So what should be, and I think you have a view, you call it, freedom feminism. So I think that this establishing women as a category and the biological difference is something that is important, that needs to be reinforced here, and it's very hard to do in this context. And in a way, I feel like the the Barbie movie, like the ending, I was confused. Like I was like, what? I thought she was going to become CEO of Mattel, and she's not. Like I was just like, but then as I was thinking more, I'm like, actually, this was a brilliant ending because she was celebrating being a woman with the burden, it was the physicality, the biology of being a woman. And it took me a while to get it, but now, but I think that's what it is. And I think that is now one of the fundamental tenets of the future of feminism. But you also talk about this, and you talk about the civility between the sexes versus the war, bringing that civility and understanding, which I think we are very close to achieving, hopefully, in most cases. But you also talk about freedom feminism as one of the tenets, right?
I just wanted to make a distinction. When I was reading these radical texts, I thought, well, I'm a feminist, but I don't identify with raging against capitalism. I didn't know why that was part of it, and denying that there was sex difference and so forth. And so I finally realized that there was something classical equality feminism, or I've called it freedom feminism, which was simply, what I believed is that men and women should be equal before the law and have the same opportunities for life, liberty, and happiness. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had their consciousness raised by reading the Declaration of Independence, and it thought it applied to them, and that's equality feminism. An equality feminist wants for women what she wants for everyone, is fair treatment, no discrimination. There's another school which actually rejects the classical liberal tradition and liberal humanism in favor of an analysis that views women as an oppressed class, that our oppression is systemic and so deep that we can't even see it. It's invisible. And their job, and what I should have been doing in the classroom, is raising their consciousness so they can see these invisible constraints that are everywhere, holding them back, defining them, and so forth. And but a funny thing happened recently, which is that for years I was debating my colleagues in feminist philosophy, who were radical feminists, many of them, and they tended to demonize men and really believed the worst about men, and had all these statistics implicating the average man and all sorts of atrocities and things. And I would debate them, and they wanted separatism, and they wanted to change the language in ways that were beyond even what we hear today. Like I had a colleague who offered not feminist. She didn't give a feminist seminar. It was a feminist ovular. And and she wasn't kidding. And she wasn't kidding. And anyway, I would argue with her. Now, these women are my friends and allies, because even though I don't agree with them about demonizing men, these radical feminists are now, a lot of them have opposed the trans movement because they don't like men, and even a guy, there was a guy and becomes a woman, and it's still a man. And they want women's spaces, and it's because they are a little bit misandrist, to use the word, not misogynist, but misandrist, and just like he meant. I don't agree with that, but I do think they have a right to be heard. And what happens is every time they try to have a seminar, an event, or a speaker, the trans activists come and shut it down and threaten them, and I'm appalled by this. So now they're my new allies.
You friends.
I found friends.
So I'd love to turn it to the audience for like some questions. You guys have some questions, remark? Anyone has a question? Yeah.
Yes, this is true. That what you find is that there are massive efforts to get more women into math and science, and women have been strengthened and they now get better grades than boys in math and science in high school, and women are entering certain scientific fields. They've taken over veterinary medicine and biology. Probably, I expect in a few years, the Nobel Prizes in biology will go to women. But relatively speaking, they haven't changed that much with engineering, and certainly not computer science. They've improved it a little bit, but not by much. And people have different theories. They think it's because it's sexism, there's something going on in these fields. And one interesting explanation that I've heard is that if you have, at the very high echelons of science, you know, who gets to be the professor at Harvard and MIT in physics, and there's so many more men than women in the Harvard physics and, you know, MIT calculus and so forth, that if you take girls that are math prodigies, or, you know, really gifted kids, the very high end of the ability distribution, there's a difference between boys and girls. A boy who is a math genius is typically not that verbal, you know, at the highest level. Verbal. The girls, if they are math prodigies, they're usually verbal prodigies as well. Mm-hmm. And that would mean that that young lady has a lot of choices, all sorts of fields. She doesn't have to go into engineering if she doesn't want to. She can go into Victorian literature, or, you know, whatever she wants. She can be a doctor. She can do it. Well, a boy who has this will almost always stay in that area, and just doesn't have the possibility. So there are sometimes positive ways of looking at women, and it's actually women's strength, but you just never see that. You just don't see that explanation. A couple of psychologists saw it, and I read it. One other thing I'll say is that if people who study sex differences cross-culturally, they find that actually the more liberated a society is, and, you know, in the post-industrial democracies, men and women actually become more different rather than more alike. In poor countries, everybody has fewer choices and fewer opportunities, and even the personalities of men and women are similar. In Sweden and France and Germany, America, you find that we have so many more choices, and women, you know, they say, well, there are more engineers in Guam than there are, you know, and there are more engineers in Honduras and Mexico than there are, you know, the rate of women going into engineering and calculus is higher in those countries. And isn't that terrible? We're even behind Mexico and Guam, they'll say. Well, maybe it's because we have so many more choices here. We don't have to do that. In a poorer country, you just have fewer options, and you really have to go into a field that's remunerative. And so, again, there's a possibility that sometimes differences are not necessarily because of discrimination. Sometimes they are synonymous with liberty and freedom and opportunity.
I'd like to add on that, though, that, you know, college counselors in a high school are not doing their job to track women or anybody into science unless they have real natural abilities, right? I mean, I feel like there is not a concerted effort to say, no, it should really be, you need to go into STEM. And then once you are in STEM, my daughters are in STEM, and it's pretty unbelievable how everybody tells them, oh my gosh, it's really hard what you're doing. That's what you hear all the time, and it's pretty hard to manage the sorority social agenda and data science classes, right? Like, so, anyway, Jackie. Well, I think that's where that objective of closing the wage gap then becomes perhaps doesn't serve society that well, having that as a policy objective of closing the wage gap, which I think to your point, but maybe you have a comment.
No, I agree with that. And there's a vast literature in the field of vocational choice and what people's preferences, and you have vocational counselors, and they'll give you tests and things to find out what you want. And there are clear differences between men and women. Of course, there's some overlap, but you can discern the difference, which is overall, women tend to be more interested in fields, sort of people-centered fields or living things, and men things, unless they have to be people. They also ask, what do you want from your career? And women want fulfillment, and they want to make a difference. They want to help people. And with men, they say want to earn a lot, maybe be a leader in my field or something. But they put a higher premium on earnings. So maybe this will change with the next generation. I keep waiting for that, but it just doesn't seem to happen. There are some changes, but you're still going to find the majority of women. I haven't seen any data that suggests that not all women, but about 60%, or actually would be 80%, because there are 20% that don't want to work at all, want to be full-time, and then that 60% that want to go in and out of the workplace or work less when they have kids. That's just the preference. And even in Sweden, they haven't been able to change it. In Sweden, they have tried everything to get the sexes to be the same, and they resist. And finally, they realized that they had to give men paternity leave with the mother. Fine, they gave it, but then they were worried that the men weren't using it. They were just writing more papers or doing more work. They weren't really. And then they realized that in the workplace, whenever a child was sick, it was always the mother that ran home. And no matter, and their wage gap is even, well, this is different, but they still have a big wage gap between men and women there. They can't erase it because of this. So what you have to do is change human nature. But I think we should have a discussion about that first,
Yeah. We should accept. So we have maybe just like one more question. Yeah, two more like.
So I was watching one of the debates not too long ago, and this kind of blew me away. Everyone was talking about, did you see what Nikki Haley was wearing? And no one was saying, well, did you see what Christie was wearing? Or, did you see? How do we break this? Like, why would people even say that? It has nothing to do with what someone's wearing.
Well, I like to think that the kind of sexism of yore is gone, but I think, I guess part of me thinks that women are sort of visibly sort of dazzling, and
This is why, and we love it.
We love Barbie.
We love it. It's back to your human nature. We all dressed up in pink to go see Barbie. So
I admit,
hey,
I did. I went with my.
Sometimes you have to assume who we are, right? It's like, yeah, it does matter what Nikki Haley wears, and I do look like her red dress, or But okay, to wrap it up, I want to be respectful of people's time. So, as you can imagine, Christina has so many friends. Like your video blogs, I'm sure attracted so much praise and kind words. And you are welcome with open arms on campus and invited to debate your colleagues in women's gender studies, right? So how do you at all? How do you? I'm being facetious here, obviously, right? You've taken a lot of arrows. And I'd love for you to kind of share with this audience, because I think if we decide to enter this field of defending women as a biological category and defending women's choices of life and career, then surely we will attract a lot of arrows. And how do you endure that, take it, and move forward and take it perhaps as a badge of honor, as I've kind of started to look at?
Well, first I should tell you that I've lost both my parents a few years ago, but my dad was always my biggest fan. But my parents were very liberal. They were, I think they were communists, though. They were so
So is my dad.
they were so left-wing. And they were a little confused when their daughter became controversial. And my dad used to listen to Rush Limbaugh just to get his blood pressure up and get mad. Mother would say, "Turn it off, dear, it's upsetting you." But as soon as she was out of the car, he'd turn on Rush and get furious. And one day he was listening, and Rush Limbaugh said, "This book, Who Stole Feminism? This is by Christina Hoff Sommers. This is I love this woman." And my dad almost lost control of the car. And then any time I do an interview, he'd rush out to get it. And on one occasion, I was interviewed where they did a little story about my book, Playboy magazine, and Dad wanted to get it, but at the time my parents were living in Vermont and my dad didn't want to go to the local store. So he went over the border to the more libertine New Hampshire and bought a Playboy. But even then he felt he had to explain himself to the clerk, and he said, "I'm only buying this because my daughter's in it." Anyway, he just made it worse. So it was always hard. But I would say, to my very, very left-wing mother, I would say, well, just look at. I know I'm not being illiberal. I'm haven't changed my politics. The world has changed, and look what's being said. And it always made me feel good, because when she would read what I said, and read what the myths and saw the anger at men. My mother was a feminist, but she never hated men. There used to be feminism where you wanted to be friends with men, you wanted to be equals. And then it became where you had to be resentful or angry or scared or something. And so it was good that in my family I could have, I could make peace with that. With friends, I lost some friends when I started criticizing, some of this. But the thing I will tell you is you make new friends. And you make new friends with whom you can be yourself, say what you think, and it opened all sorts of new doors, new opportunities. I'm an accidental sort of activist philosopher. I never meant to be controversial. I just sort of spoke out on things that I thought, and I honestly believed that if I pointed them to some good data and showed them that their arguments weren't coherent, they would agree with me and problem solved. That turns out not to be the case. It's more complicated. I still haven't figured out what do we do and how do we stop, a movement that seems dysfunctional, that doesn't seem to lead towards progress. It seems to be the reverse. But now I have a lot of friends and colleagues, and it's the opposite of being lonely. If you take a controversial position, which I still feel is grounded in morality and a vision of a good society, it's something worth fighting for, and other people will help. But the sad thing is that it's hard. I thought, as I said, that this wouldn't. I never thought we'd get to where we are now. Things have not gotten better for boys. They haven't gotten. I don't think they've better for feminism, but I do believe in the law of happy surprises. Conservatives are criticized for being, always talking about the law of unintended consequences. Things are going to get much, much worse, and they probably will. But sometimes they get better. The Berlin Wall falls when you least expect it. Maybe this will fall. And before we know it, things will reverse. But I think it helps to have groups like this. The more, the better. I admire what you are all doing, because that's what makes change. It's the only thing probably that, besides wars, is people getting together. And it can be a small, determined group, and we can do this.
Yeah, I guess it's true that you make new friends. You might lose some, but you make new friends. And actually, I have to say that almost like, I think over 10 years ago, I heard you speak at a panel, the Women's Conference, hosted by AEI in Chicago. And it was following that presentation that Joan Lasson, who's back there, and then some neighbors that I brought with me, we said, you know what, why don't we just get together and talk about these things in our home. And that's it was the catalyst for starting the Posse Circle. So it's kind of an honor to be like full circle, making new friends. And having you here, so thank you so much.